Manchester, and among other distinctions, chairs the Legal Redress Committee for the Greater Manchester branch of the NAACP, the nation's oldest and most significant civil rights organization, which is more than 100 years old now. And to his left is Barbara Keshen, who has the distinction of having been a prosecutor, a defense attorney, and the legal director for the New Hampshire Civil Liberties Union. So we've got some great experience here. I guess what I was thinking about in watching the film is that the film is it's basically an autobiography. It's a story of this one guy, Darius, but the reason it's significant is because it's related to some bigger stories or some other stories. So what I'd love for you each to share a little bit to get this started is your reaction to the film and sort of what's the story of Darius that was interesting to you, but then also what is it connected to that's kind of perhaps on a different or larger social or institutional scale? What's the other story or stories that this is about? And we'll do a little bit of back and forth, and then we'll open it up for discussion for everybody in the room to be able to participate, because I know that certainly Norm has some things to say from his experience, and I know that other people in the room, some of whom, because I know you, will have some other things to say as well. So when do we start with you, Wesley, if you don't mind? Yeah.
Well, the most interesting thing to me about the film was the fact that he was an honor student. And so it seemed like he was on the right path. And if that was through his family members, or was that just him who decided that it's about the education? But when it comes to the family members and him hearing his parents struggling, he went the exact opposite. But yet he still had the education and what he wanted to do in life on one side of the brain. The other was helping his parents out. So I thought that was interesting.
Woullard, do you want to?
Yeah, I guess one of the things that I kind of thought about in looking at the film was I reflected a little bit on what was the story that the filmmaker was attempting to tell through his own experience and his sort of like autobiography. And my first reaction to the film and the title, and everything, Evolution of a Criminal, I thought, is he trying to talk about how, what were the factors that led to him engaging in this behavior that results in him being branded a criminal, because, any act can be illegal if there's a law that, forbids it and you violate it. Then, as the film went on, I thought a little bit about, well, man, maybe the title of the film is, A Tale of Redemption, where evolution of a criminal means what happened after he had, engaged in the criminal act. But I think that it's it's an individual story, and in some ways, if we only look at it as an individual story, without looking at the institutional context, if we look at it just a personal story without looking at the collective experience of his community and history and all that, then it becomes a morality tale, Les Miserables, where my family is starving, so I steal a loaf of bread, that kind of thing. However, as we were listening to the story, and he was talking about his reflections and all, there were several things that were said that kind of, I think, pointed to some of the factors that led to his some of the outcomes in his life. Early on, they talked about when he did it, he was a kid, he was a teenager, and teenagers make a lot of mistakes. Some not as serious as the one that he made, but for all of us here who've been teenagers, we've all got things in our lives that we can look back and say, yeah, I probably shouldn't have done that, you know. I think that, but I come away thinking that the story of the video is is limited because it focuses primarily on it, because it only looks really or explores that personal experience and the personal aspect of a story. What do you think?
Well, I thought this was a really powerful film, and I thought that there were a lot of universal themes that I really resonated with, and the three that I thought were the most powerful for me, and really the most universal when I think about my, you know, my career in criminal law, which spanned almost 30 years, was first the family, and how they suffered as a result of what their son had done. And I thought a lot about, you know, when you're a prosecutor and you work with victims, you get to offer them services. Society says there's a hurt that we recognize, and there are victim witness advocates, and there's attention paid to what they're going through. But it broke my heart as a public defender to see the families of people who, you know, when their sons mostly had done terrible things they had to come to grips with, that they felt a lot of guilt for, that they really suffered it as a result of what had happened, and there was nothing to offer them. And so that was one of the themes that came across for me. The second theme was sort of, you know, they talked a lot about the family and the stressors on the family, and what you know, working all these jobs and not having outlets, and there was so much pressure that was built up, and the image that I kept thinking about was sort of like an aorta, that just all this pressure, and at the weak point it's going to erupt, and I felt like that with this boy. He was the weak point, and he erupted. It was a system that was under a lot of pressure and a lot of stress, and he was the weak point, and that's what erupted. And I think that that's probably more typical than we believe. But the third thing that really struck me was the power of restorative justice. For him to be able to take it upon himself to admit his wrong, and to go to the victims of the crime and acknowledge what they had done. I think, my guess is that minister would say that meeting gave him more than all the retribution and all the punishment that this kid went through. But to that personal connection, that personal recognition that I was wrong, I hurt you, I atone, I'm sorry, and it's genuine. I think restorative justice is a powerful system, and it brings healing in a much more than, you know, our system of retributive justice.
About the restorative justice, like that's some of the things that we implement at SYSC in regards to assaults and things like that. And so, just like the film, in your opinion, like the residents, they would rather be put in their room than to have to face the accuser, the juvenile probation officer, the parent, because, you know, like it's a panel where we ask the kid certain questions, and then we talk to the parents, and they tell us what that phone call was like, or if a kid goes AWOL, what that person felt when they was either running after him, thinking about losing their job, and so hearing it from someone else as far as the kids goes, they're scared of that. They're scared of that, and whether they told him to do this restorative justice or not, it's really big and it's powerful. It's powerful.
Wesley, back up a second, just because again, the term restorative justice is a bit of a, sort of an in-house term, or maybe it's obvious what it means, and maybe everybody in the room is familiar with it, but just in case anybody isn't, what would be sort of a short description or definition of what restorative justice means to you?
Repairing the harm.
Yeah, okay.
Sure and sweet.
So focusing on repairing the harm, whether it's a harm to individuals who were harmed, or in a sense, there's also a harm to a community that's been done by an offense that someone commits.
Correct.
So focusing on that rather than on, we're gonna punish you.
We're gonna punish you.
Yeah.
Right.
And you're trying to make that work.
Yes. And it works well.
Yeah, and
It works well.
Well, just to say, restorative justice does involve punishment. That's a part of it. But it's not to the exclusion of something that is more healing and more, it advances things.
You know, I was thinking about, you had asked me earlier about how I should be introduced in my role today, and actually I come at this particular video and topic from a number of different directions. One, I'm a member of the Manchester Police Commission.
That's right.
So, I'm kind of like on that side of the fence. But also, as, we sit here, one of the thoughts that I had was that part of as I watched the film, I thought, then they talked about the family, the context, the culture, the experience that the boy came out of. One of the things I kind of thought about was that, now increasingly, since the 2008 Great Depression, we hear, recession rather, we hear discussion about income inequality, income inequality and that kind of, but income inequality didn't start with the 2008 Great Recession, and though the parents, of the boy and the community that he came out of, they were kind of like faced with that, and probably there was a discussion, some comments made in the film based, that reflected both this sense that there was this early on, that there was this ongoing sort of generationally accumulated, debt or economic hampering, inability, lack of resources. And then later on, there was one of his relatives was talking about she was suggesting that there was possibly maybe a spiritual legacy or almost like a generational curse that was, contributed to this outcome that the kid had. And I don't think those things are unrelated. Even now, as we talk about restorative justice as part of sort of like an approach to dealing with offenders, across the board as a criminal justice or approach. It kind of makes me think about some of the work that I've done in my role as a board member for the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. When we start bringing up this issue about restorative justice, it's okay to talk about it on an individual level because there is individual responsibility for our actions. But oftentimes we leave out the part of the institutional accountability in addition to the individual responsibility. So that's I see all of that's kind of playing into what's going on.
That's good. And when I'm looking at this and I'm thinking about, it's related to inequality, which like incarceration also has a big race gap in terms of wages and income in the country. And there's another gap in terms of who gets arrested and who gets sent to prison and how long they spend there. But so what I'm thinking also about, this kid is, he's in a setting in which he sees his dad working 2 jobs and his mom working really hard and his grandmother working, and they're busting their butts and they're not getting anywhere. And he's thinking, where am I?
And he's watching television and they're saying like, oh, you should have a MasterCard and
all this
priceless
stuff now.
experiences.
But so there's that social context. But then there's also, I was thinking about this line, the very last line of the film is the uncle. And he's saying, nobody determines my destiny but me. So we've got both of these things are going on at the same time.
Right. So there is that individual responsibility where we're able to make choices. But policy oftentimes and institutional prerogatives, also kind of oftentimes shape options, because he's saying that, like he said, as a 3-time loser.
Yeah.
He's not saying that before,
Right,
he's
right.
saying that after,
Yeah. Okay, good. What are other people, what's on other people's minds here? What?
We had a couple of us have been public defenders for a number of years. He seemed to have made it most when he was going to jail, just before he been sentenced for 5 years, which, I can remember you saying, well, that's a hell of a deal. And I said that to my clients for years, that's a heck of a deal. Half the life they've lived, you're gonna spend in jail again. Like they're 20 years old, you're gonna get 10 years in jail. How I never knew how to plan for if their life had really ended and they're gonna have to start a completely new life. And that's what he did. And I saw him as just stopping, his life stopped. It really didn't matter what he'd done before. It really was going forward. How little we do is I did as a public defender to try to prepare people for what the full impact of what they did. And there was nobody else there that's going to do it. And bringing social workers pre-sentence, letting people out. I thought it was very moving.
One of the things that struck me a little bit more, I watched the first half of the film this morning, and then I had company coming over and I had to cook, so I didn't see the rest of the film until we saw it just now. And one of the things that jumped out at me more from maybe just from the second half was the importance of religion in the lives of the people in the story, and in relationship to restoration or to the possibility of redemption or the possibility of forgiveness. And I'm curious, in your experiences and from other folks here, is that an essential element, or was that just something is that an element that can be helpful?
That's our culture. Like, God,
You say our, who's our?
well, that's,
OYS people.
I could say black people. Like, I don't know about you and your family, but my family go to church every Sunday, continue to struggle, you get on your knees and pray and you ask God to give you things and things don't take place. Anybody could say, okay, well then he's not there because he's not helping us out. But religion has always played a role in our lives, and that's the only thing that we can look to, whether he grants it or not. So religion has always been, it's always been a part of my family's life from day one.
Yeah.
And say about that.
Yeah. I'm curious if this model, we talk about restorative justice and redemption and repair and atonement and things. I mean, atonement is also a religious concept.
Right.
But can it work without, without that faith basis, or without a Christian basis even explicitly? Because Christianity isn't the same thing as religion either.
Right. I would say that it's true that American-born people of African descent have leaned heavily on religion, and partly because there was, as a respite or refuge from the inhuman experiences they had with their fellow man. But what it does though, and what we saw in the film is that, for people to be able to continue, they gotta have hope. They gotta believe that, things can, you were mentioning the comments at the end of the film. You know, you gotta believe that things can be different. You gotta believe that things can be better. And one way, you know, one avenue or one source for that kind of, you know, hope for the future for some people is religion. You know, so in that way, I think it you know, it does. But I think there's secular kind of, they're both interfaith. I think that, you know, this religion and this belief beyond your personal limitations, you know, and a belief in being able to move beyond your present circumstances is something that is reflected in, you know, most faith traditions. You know, that's why they call them faith traditions.
I don't think it has anything to do with it. I think that it may be coextensive or coexistent, but it has to do more with, you know, to be able to, as you said, to be able to accept responsibility and to face someone that you've hurt. That's huge, and that's really hard to do, and that has to do with maturity and who you are as a person, I think irrespective of faith. And whether or not the person who you're looking at, asking forgiveness from, or not even asking forgiveness from, I think all what you're doing with restorative justice is at least starting by acknowledging the pain that you've caused. You know, maybe a person of faith is more willing to have that conversation, maybe not, I don't know. I can't imagine that it really has much to do with religion.
I wasn't suggesting that, and I'm not saying that you were saying that I was, but I think that there's a level of reflection in terms of, in order to be able to say, for anyone to be able to take responsibility, it requires a certain level of reflection, you know, self-reflection, that oftentimes, you know, that doesn't require religion, but in this particular case in this video, that I think one of the vehicles they use to be able to continue and to believe that there's a better future that we can make a change was religion. But it's not the only way.
Yeah.
I thought about that a lot during the film, and it seemed, and I'm not a religious person, but it seemed to me that religion was most important in that film to the victims, and several, at least two, maybe more of the victims, he went up and he knocked on their door, no, I think three of them, and said basically, I am so sorry, can you forgive me? And at least three people said, yeah, I'm a Christian, or I'm saved, and therefore I can find it within myself to forgive you, or therefore it's my duty to forgive you, so I can forgive you. And as unrelated as I am to that kind of faith, it sounded true. It sounded really deep with those people. So it seemed like it certainly meant something. It made a difference to the victims.
Even if his family members who were victims of his act.
Also, yeah.
So it's an interesting thing. I mean, in a society that, while it is religiously diverse, but where Christianity is so deeply rooted, that the language of Christianity is a common language for a lot of people in the culture, whether they're churchgoers or not, and maybe that makes some things possible that aren't. You know, I don't know. What do you think, Ron?
I was just thinking, I mean, this whole thing is about the human experience, and when you look at religion, I look at spiritual, and you can't separate humanism from spirit. They both, you know, go hand in hand. I looked at the film, and what I was thinking of is, given the circumstances and the situation that these people came from, they were victims of a system. And as victims of the system, you dehumanize the system. It's not humanistic anymore. It's that, and it's preying on me. And to do the act that he did, he had to dehumanize it. And he had to put it into a non-human perspective so he could convince himself to do these things. Because his upbringing said, no, you can't do this. But all of a sudden, here he is with two other guys doing something that is not his history. And so he dehumanized it, and the restorative justice is to rehumanize it, and is to put the human parts back into it at all levels, so that this event, when they did it, it was just an event, and these weren't people, these were just probably just things that were in the way of what they needed. But when you pull out of that and you want to do restorative justice, you have to rehumanize it, and you have to look at decent people.
So how do we, I mean, in a society, again, where we've got more people locked up in prison in this country than any other country in the world, and we've got a higher proportion of people locked up in prison than any other country in the world, as I understand it. And you may know more than me, but my impression is that the insides of prisons are not friendly, or not humanistic environments.
They're not.
So how,
They come back to prison.
yeah, so how, is there a way then to, the deck seems stacked then. If in order to have a restorative process, you need to help people recover their own humanity and understand the humanity of others, including people that they've harmed, does the way we approach crime and corrections make that more possible, less possible, practically impossible? What, you know, what do folks think?
I think one factor here is, you know, the prosecutor and the two police officers who arrested him, you know, there was nothing bad about them in the movie, but they were white. And one obvious problem, I think, in the system is that the people who run the criminal justice system don't come from the same communities as the people who are in the prisons. And, you know, at other times, like if you compare, you know, crime in the United States with, say, the experience of when, you know, when the Irish or the Italians came to, like, cities in the US, you know, the police, the prosecutors, the whole system was people who looked like them, and they were sort of concerned about them at a different level. They wanted to deal with crime, but they were concerned about their kids going away for a long time. And in the US, there's a real problem that the people who run the system have very little in common with the people who end up in the system.
Now, is that your experience from your, I mean, you didn't identify yourself in terms of your own background, but I happen to know a little bit that you know a thing or two about the system, so.
Yeah, I mean, in New Hampshire it's
yeah.
different, but when I've worked, say,
Yeah.
in Massachusetts, it's certainly true that, you know, a lot of the criminal defendants are black or Hispanic. A lot of the prosecutors and the police and the judges are white. And as I said, I mean, I'm not sure how exactly race plays into the process is something that I don't understand. But one thing that I read that makes sense to me is that, you know, when it's your own community's children that are both the victims of the crime and the perpetrators of the crime, we just approach the problem differently than when, you know, you are so removed from them and they're like, you know, living in other communities, and that I think may be an obvious part of the problem.
I think, just to tailgate a little bit on what you're saying, Bizad, I think that there are two things, one of which is what you said, which is, I thought was great. I mean, the whole system dehumanizes. You know you're gonna be, you know, here's these kids, and you know you're gonna be putting them in prison for a long time. How do you do that as you're a prosecutor? I was a prosecutor, I went to prosecutor school. They told me, you know, you don't even look at the defendant. That defendant might as well be having they said a brown bag over their head. You know, that is not a person to you. And it can't be a person to you, or you can't do your job. So there's that level of dehumanization. And then the second thing is, and we see it all the time, in our system of justice, or you go to trial, There's winners and there's losers. And so, and that's all that there is. So you either win or you lose at trial. And what that does, and I think, is just, it polarizes people, and it doesn't leave room for understanding, and it ratchets up sentences. Because, you know, if my neighbor got broken into and that guy went to prison for 5 years, then I want my perpetrator to go to prison for 6 years. So, you know, I think, I'm not so sure it's racism or whatever it is. I think it's just those two things of desensitization and polarization that is endemic in that system.
I think part of one of the, you want to say something?
No, go ahead, go ahead.
All right, well, I'll try and make it short. But but I think as we talk about sort of like some of the dynamics, and I made reference to institutional processes in society. You know, when we look at America and America's history, you know, one of the earliest acts back in 1676, you know, at the time when everybody coming to America to work, European or African, were indentured servants. You know, the split when the racial bribe of creating this thing called the white race dehumanized people of African descent, and then over time that became institutionalized in law and in social custom. So you know, I mean, that doesn't necessarily you know, absolve that the individual responsibility, but there's still a level of you know, institutional accountability that we got to take into consideration, so that when we sit here in this room, you know, all of us, I'm looking around and, you know, I see a couple of people with master's degrees and maybe a couple of PhDs here, you know, and we've all heard this, you know, the story about the sequencing of the human genome, you know, that said like, yeah, we're the scientists, we checked it out, and this thing called race and racial categories, there's no basis for it scientifically. In fact, yet there are those of us sitting in this room who will say, well, yeah, you know, I'm white, you know, and others will say, yeah, well, you know, like, you know, I mean, I'm black, and as a black person, and that is an ultimate social polarization that we experience in, you know, in American society, and it trickles down. You know, Arnie was talking about, mentioned that there's a, you know, that America has this gigantic prison population, you know, but when we look at, you know, who comprises that population, you know, you see certain kinds of institutional biases or practices, you know, you see certain kind of institutional prerogatives that privilege some people call white supremacy, and that, you know, punishes others. So, you know, I mean, I think that if we only look at this as a personal morality play, where, you know, oh, this guy fell from grace and now he's redeemed himself, then I think we're really missing the story. If not the total story, a large part of it.
I was reading a story today, or an article by the guy who's the head of the Sentencing Project, which is an organization that, you know, is mostly a research group, but they're really trying to figure out, like, why are so many people in prison, and if that's a problem, what do we do about it? He says, you can't talk about it really without talking about race in this country at this point. So that has to be part of the discussion, and the structure of racism going back to, you know, whenever you want to start it, Woullard, has got to be part of our understanding of how to address it.
So, I mean, why do you think Darius, I think Darius, you know, there are allusions to what you're talking about in this film, but that's not where he focused, so why do you think that he didn't focus there?
Go ahead.
Because I'm looking at it from a different angle. This is about a kid who is 16 years old, and he committed a crime serious enough to be prosecuted as an adult. If he had committed a crime that would have just been a misdemeanor, he could have gone to the local juvenile detention center, been there till he was 17 or 18 or whatever the law is, aged out of the system, and then he would have gotten his life back together. Unfortunately, the situation became an adult situation. But if you look at it through the eyes of a 16-year-old who has to go to prison, he's trying to put his life back together. He's realized that he's screwed up. He sees the need for an education. He lost the opportunity because he left high school, so he had to get the GED. And then from there, he knows that if he's gonna make something of himself when he gets out, he's got to go on to college. So I don't see this as a racial issue. I see this as from the eyes of a 16-year-old boy who really made a big mistake. And he got his friends together and they all committed this crime. You know, and maybe at some point in their life they kind of looked at it like it was more of a game and they got away with it. His intentions were to help his family, not realizing what was really going to happen to himself and his friends. So that's how my take on this whole situation.
Yeah, but then the underlying question is, but why was his family struggling so?
Well, because that's just where they lived. They lived in a very poor area. The family was struggling whether he committed the crime or not. That's how I see it. I mean, it was maybe generations living in a very poor area, and they were always struggling. And he saw, was bright enough to figure out that there's got to be a way to get beyond this, that he didn't want his life to be full of a lot of struggles. And that's what I was taking from this.
And I question, you know, if he were white, whether the same result would have happened to him. I think that what Faisal tried to suggest and highlight as a question of the different mores and the different communities and the people who are in charge and the people who aren't.
Like, for example, here they skipped over the fact that he was certified to be tried as an adult. I mean, obviously this was a very serious crime. You know, they went into a bank and they had a sawed-off shotgun. But there are in fact a lot of serious crimes. And, you know, of all this, and throughout American history, I think, like, for various reasons, a lot of it having to do with the practicality of, you know, how much does it cost to catch various people, only a small fraction of all the crimes actually get solved. And of those, only, you know, a fraction of them end up being prosecuted. And of juveniles, only a small fraction of them end up getting prosecuted as adults. And this may not be a good example of it, but certainly I think we have seen in other cases where, you know, you've got two 16-year-olds and the question is, which one is going to just go to juvenile detention, which one is going to go to adult prison, and for whatever reasons, I think those outcomes do seem to be correlated with race and the, you know, so that may be one place where race enters it. But I mean, this story may not be typical. I'm not saying, like, you know, what happened to this person is because he was black.
You know, I'll disagree, but agree. It's all about money. That's what it is. It's all about money. I've seen white 17-year-olds with no money, no attorneys and whatnot get certified as adults because they didn't have the resources. The ones with the resources, that doesn't happen to them, whether they're white, brown, black, whatever. Right now, today, I will say it's all about the money. Now, if we're saying the black population has less money than the white population, okay, that's a fact, but the bigger fact is money, you know? And I resonate with what you said. You know, when we look at the prisons, our system is based and has been based for the longest time on retribution. It's a retributive system. Time for crime. That's it. And so there's no humanizing it or any of that. New Hampshire in statute has restorative justice. They have more rehabilitative flavor to working with kids and delinquents. I mean, that's the separation between adult and juvie in New Hampshire. And so you'll see a big difference, but I'm not surprised, you know, to see that statistically, I think it's 1 out of 2 who go to jail go back. I'm not surprised because it's retribution. And And we're cultured, we're taught that. And I can't tell you how many families will sit there and, let's say their house got broken into by a kid down the street, okay? House got broken into by a kid down the street, 6 months later, that kid's back home. We'll get the phone calls with the complaints. How dare you let this kid go out after just 6 months when they did this to my house? Not understanding anything that went in the 6-month period. So until we change our philosophy about criminality, crime and whatnot, it's gonna stay the same. Brent?
I agree that it is about money, because that's what slavery was about. It was free labor. So it was less about the color of the person's skin, and it was more about the free labor and about money. However, people of African descent then and now, today, in 2014, are still looked at as less than human beings. And so that's attached, Arnie, to why we have more people of color in our prison system, including in the state of New Hampshire.
That's right.
Because people of color are looked at as less than human. It's a hard pill to swallow, but that's how you are able to get the free labor and continue to divide people with this talk of, I'm different from Judy because of the color of my skin. So we keep with the divide so we don't look at the money. I mean, because that money that guy took was far less than some of the money that we know of that some of the other folks took. So it's the human piece and it's the money piece.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, like, as far as, like, that race thing goes. I give you an example. I was a part of the African refugee film. I had a resident that was in Sununu, and he was a part of this film. So we're walking out after the film was over, and I get these people coming down the street, and they're asking me, where could I score drugs? And there was other white people coming, and so they bypass them. Where can I get drugs? Or I go to a stoplight and they'll lock their car door. So it's things like that that are common. I laugh at it now, because there's not really much you can do. Like, I just think that's just a part of society, and that's why in a position where I am at Sununu, the kids, like, they look up to me. They look up to me because, like, I don't let those things bother me, and I also stand up for the people, black or white, if I feel something is not right. You know what I mean? So I speak my mind, I hold my ground, I dress the way I want to dress. Had dinner with the governor. So I've had both sides of the coin, and my family, this family reminds me of mine, and if that was my parents, they would have kept the money too. They would have kept it too.
I thought that was really, what they found, the way they handled that was, it was so,
Right, you
they
probably
were
wouldn't
so
have-
conflicted.
Right, because you wouldn't have kept it, right? You would, like, I'm sure the majority, like, if your kid, you came inside your bedroom and saw all that money, you would, I wouldn't.
I'm not
Because of
saying-
that struggle.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, what that showed is that this was a family that was in crisis, not just this kid, that they didn't know how to deal with this windfall, and,
But when that windfall, they still gotten good.
Yeah, right.
This,
Which
the
they
money
do.
from the bank robbery. They do that, you know.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a windfall, I
Right,
mean,
well,
and they, you know, kind of
Yeah.
like dealt with that whole, so they were conflicted. In fact, as the film was showing, you know, I mean, I think there are a lot of, I know some folk who very well may have called the police, you know, and, or, you know, like, hey, I found this money out behind my house. They wouldn't necessarily turn the son in. But, you know, I mean,
Well, that's what the uncle was supposed to tell them to do.
Well, no,
Help me
he
out
told-
of this
Yeah,
situation.
right, he did. He said like, hey, take it out of the house so we can find it. You don't have it. But, you know, I think that actually, I agree. And looking at this, my reaction is that it's really, you know, economic and it's values, you know, and part of the challenge that we face is that, you know, the myth of race that this society used to dehumanize people of African descent into these categories called black and white. Well, melanin or lack of melanin is a meter for humanity. So if you're melanin deficient, you're fully human. And the more melanin you got, the less human you are. It sort of, I mean, it appears to complicate things, especially when these, you know, the prerogatives of white privilege, you know, and black punishment are institutionalized, you know, in law, policy, and social practice, so that you can be, you know, I'm a good person. Why do people, you know, I mean, like, okay, so what did these guys, all these people end up in you know, prison, or the discussion early on a little while ago about the cocaine sentencing law disparity, where, you know, one group gets so much more, you know, punishment so much more severe. It can happen, and like, you know, I mean, we can say, you know, there's no, you know, I mean, it's just how things are, or how things worked out. So definitely, I think that it would be a mistake for any of us. You know, I have a couple of adult children, and I was saying earlier, you know, made it through the teen years with them, you know. But, I mean, so there's definitely individual responsibility in terms of our choices, but we also have to take into consideration, into account, institutional accountability in terms of the options.
If I can pick up on what Warren said earlier, the United States has the most prisoners of all countries in the world. And it's interesting that of those prisoners who are in jail, or in prison, only the minority of them are in there for the original crime. Most prisoners are in prison for recurring crimes. So it's all about retribution. They come out of the system programmed to be criminals.
Yep.
And that's what they do. And there's no retribution or no goal seeking involved.
So let's, as we start to wind this up, because I know Jemmy and Montana probably are hoping that we will wrap this up at some point. Do you have another film in here anyway?
Actually,
No.
I'm on the edge of my chair here, so you guys.
We were
You know,
hoping to
this
hear
is
that.
great.
Well, I mean, it's just, let's, all right, I'll take it on myself. I don't want to sit here all night. But, let's try to sort of say, so what, you know, what helps us, I mean, this is a great story. It's a lovely story about a kid who screws up and finds his way, we hope, on a path where not only is he going to get his act together, but the rest of us are going to learn something from the process, and that's why we're all here, because we're learning something from this. But in terms of what we're learning, what are some ways we can bring this back to you know, from Houston to New Hampshire? It sounds like there's a lot of agreement in the room that these things are not just it's systemic stuff, it's complicated, there's a lot of different things that are going on, but that there's also some ways that we already know about that the system could be better. Better for the people who are harmed by crime, better for the people who have engaged in criminal activity, better for the community as a whole. What's some steps to take? Could be personal, could be local, could be, yeah.
I'd like to show this film at the Sununu Center
That's a great idea.
and have the kids and the staff see it.
Yeah.
Because it is restorative justice without using any of the terms or any, that's the way it ought to be. You know, and this, I think this family and this youth took it upon themselves to do it without even knowing that there's actually a process out there
Right.
that could deliver this systemically. You know, so I like.
Hang on a sec, do you think do you have a clue as to whether, sort of, I mean, the film is just being distributed or it's not really even distributed yet?
Yeah,
Right.
the filmmaker is everywhere,
Okay.
being interviewed and things. I bet we could get to him. I think for a purpose like that, that they would.
The film could actually be offered as a kind of a microcosm of the experience. We're given screening rights to the film. I don't see why that would be an issue.
Yeah.
So, all right, so have a chat.
Rights being what they are.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but sure.
Good, Brent?
I think it's a good film, and I think it's important that even though it's a film about an individual and a family, I think it's important to talk about the institutional structures that really come to play in not only the criminal justice system, but the education system, the healthcare system, just up and
Wage
down the
system.
line, And even though people have a difficult time talking about racism and white supremacy and melanin enhanced and melanin deficient, we gotta find a way as a country to come to grips with that, you know, for our next generation. I mean, it is our responsibility to do it, and we need to step up.
Thank you. Good.
I agree. I think one of the things that this film did really successfully was to break through that cycle of dehumanization, and you got to know this kid Darius as an individual and his family, and when you know them as people, you can then start to say, you know, okay, we can show them this much sympathy. How did they get in such bad shape?
One of the challenges of knowing them as individuals is that it also gives you, you know, the license to ignore the institutional factors that come into play. And as long as we ignore the institutional stuff, as long as, you know, there are people in this room who say, well, you know what, I'm human and you're human. You know, as long as they're not saying that, but rather they're saying, oh, well, I'm white and you're black, then you're setting up certain kinds of, you know, you're playing into these institutional prerogatives that, you know, that lead to certain, it provides a context for outcomes. It doesn't necessarily determine them, but in many ways it defines them. Like a lot of people talk about, you know, how this, you know, like how, you know, race doesn't matter, and how young people today are changing their mind. But you know, I think I think back to the this experiment done by sociologist Kenneth B. Clark back in 1954 called the doll test. The doll where they had these kids look at these little baby dolls, you know, and they updated the test, you know, and did it in, you know, I think like around 2005 or something like that. And so if you're not familiar with that, you know, Google it and check it out, because we have to. I think that if we continue to ignore the context within which a lot of this stuff happens, and some of the institutional stuff, and focus on the individual, then, you know, it's like, oh, well, the system is okay, we just got to repair the people, you know.
Well,
and I don't know if that's the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I've been learning from my organizer training friends over the last couple of years is about the importance of stories. You know, so a lot of people out there saying if we're going to change the system, we've got to, the way to get to people perhaps is by telling stories. So maybe can we use a story like this as a way to shed light on these systemic things, whereas if we just start out by talking about the system, we might not be able to get people's attention. Do you think that? What's that? Go ahead.
I can say, I personally think this is a great success story. Like, he came out, he changed his life for the better, and did something he always wanted to do. He succeeded in life, and I think it's a great story for everyone in institutions or not, because it's like a lot of people, I'm not saying everyone's like this, but in institutions, a lot of people assume, and a lot of people don't always help the way they can. They assume, they act on what they think and what they heard in training. They don't go off of what they know of the person. So like, I've been in places, not prison per se, but similar situations, and there's this dude and he set a pamphlet on my like bed, and he was like, fill this out, and I was like, okay, and I filled it out, gave it to him. Next day he was like, this is your problem, this is what's wrong with you, this is how we're gonna fix you, and this is why you did this. I'm like, I only talked to you for 5 minutes, how can you know all this about me? And so like, you know, institutions, there are some people that help you, like, there are some really good people. I met a man named Chris and Bob, and they didn't like dehumanize me, they didn't like be like, oh, you're just another patient, or you're just another person in here for whatever reason. They like treated me like I was just, you know, a friend, like another human, and they like interacted with me like they'd interact with anyone else, and that helped me a lot, because I was like, yeah, you understand me, you know what I'm going through, you're sharing your experiences with me, and that's actually what helped me become a better person, because if that didn't happen, I can honestly say I don't think I'd be where I am today, because, you know, no one helped me until they came along, you know, everyone was just like, oh, this is your problem, and so this is how we're going to deal with you, and they were like, no, we're going to get to know you. And I think it's those people that really matter, instead of the people that are just like, you know, oh, this is why you're in here, this is how I'm going to treat you.
Which is where those professors found themselves once they knew the story. But then they admit they would not have wanted to know it ahead of time.
So that's why I think this story is really good and should be shared, because it gives people hope. Like, if I do put my mind to something and I do have someone I can fall back on, I can do amazing things. Because I'm currently just graduated. I'm 18, I just moved here. And I went to NHGI for like a semester, went for psychology. And I dropped out because it wasn't right at the time for me. Like, there's too much stuff going on in other places. But I want to go back to school really bad, so I'm looking for a job and stuff like that. And I want to go for psychology and filmmaking, because those are my two big interests. So, seeing someone be able to do that.
Alright, so if any of you have a job, or
Yeah, anyone.
Get out
any
of
thoughts, Wesley,
psychology.
as we start to wrap up?
No, I just think, as far as, as far as society goes with I think it's a struggle, because, you know, this has been going on for so long, and, when things are etched into people's minds, like, change doesn't happen overnight, you know, you don't give up, you continue to fight, you know, for what's right, and, you know, that's the way I've been raised, and, I want to continue to fight.
Wesley, share what you were telling me earlier, though, about when you release a young man, he gets a list of support network.
Yeah, well, like each kid that leaves Sununu, they have a community support card where it has numbers that the resident can call in time of need. And the kid that we just released, you know, like they put on this big bravado thing, but inside the kid was crying, you know, but he was too tough to show it, but you could just tell, like in the business for so long, you could tell when a person is really scared to get out there in society, you know, so I just reminded him, look, like, I'm always gonna be there, you have these numbers, just in case kids get in, you know, situations where, you know, they can't go talk to their mom. Like this one kid, his mom, he's African, so he can't go and talk to her or his dad. So we just try and do whatever we can for the resident before they leave with this community support card. We try and get them their driver's license. We give them clothes. They have paying jobs there. So we try and put these guys on the right path, but again, like it's going to be up to individual, you know, just like it was up to him, up to me. It's gotta be the person, and you gotta want it.
I think that's really good that you guys do that. Like, you give them a card and say, you can call me anytime.
Right.
Because when I left where I was, I had no one. Like, they just threw me out, and I was like, into the cold embrace of what is real life. And like I said, I was lost. I had no idea what I was doing. You know, I still am. Still have no idea what I'm doing. Yeah. So I think that's fantastic.
You know, the way that people get treated at the youth detention center and in the state prison and in the counties is within a political system in New Hampshire also. So that we've got lawmakers and policymakers and people who are establishing what are the budgets for different types of programs, what are the parameters, and that becomes extremely possible. I'm sure everybody knows we've just come through an election. I don't know if you looked at all the postcards that showed up in your mailbox, but some of them were using very much racially tinged images to try to suggest that some people should be defeated because they were soft on crime, and some people should be elected because they were going to be tough on crime. So this is very much the equation of people of color with criminality, and the use of that to get people elected is not just in our past. It's very much alive in New Hampshire right now. So that's, I mean, just something to keep some attention to. I also say that I read an interesting article that was in the Huffington Post yesterday or today that was about the possibility, as we sort of look at what's going on in Washington after the election and where there might be common ground between the president and the Republican-dominated Congress, and they're actually suggesting that criminal justice reform might be an area where they can find some common ground. Because there's been some stuff happening within the conservative parts of the Republican Party that are also realizing that this punishment retribution approach
It's costing a lot.
Costs a lot of money and it's not working very well. So they're starting to look at some alternatives, and there might be, there might be some possibilities there. We will get opportunities to talk to people who would like to be the leader of the country, because they'll be coming to pay us a visit here in Concord and maybe even in Mount Vernon over the next 14 months. And that gives us an unusual opportunity and perhaps unusual responsibility to talk to them about a serious problem of our country, which is the way that we're dealing with these issues. And the prospects, the possibility that we've seen from this film, we've seen from your stories about the hope that things could be done a different way. That's not going to happen by itself, but we can be part of making some things happen. So, any other final sort of takeaways for folks as we walk out?
I love the cop in the high school who tells the kid, keep your mouth shut. Apparently he didn't, but,
So that's your message.
yeah. Just put people who care about people in schools.
Good. Anything else? Great, thanks Jemmy in Montana for making this happen. Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks Wesley, Woullard, and Barbara.
I didn't recognize you the first time.